Hello and welcome to this segment of Meet a Columban. I'm Fr Jim Mulroney and I'm your host, and our guest today is Fr Paul McCartin.
Hello, Jim.
Paul is an Australian and he was ordained a priest back in 1978, and ever since then he's been working in Japan. Now, Japan is not a place that we hear a lot about in our media in Australia. But one thing that has been in the news quite a lot lately was the 10th anniversary of the meltdown of the nuclear power reactor in Fukushima. When that happened, when it was hit by a 17-metre high tsunami and also a 9.0 on the Richter scale earthquake, resulted in 3 reactors suffering from meltdown. The activity around the power plant at that time, and also the looking after the people who lived in the town and worked in the power plant, seemed to have a lot of the attitude of ill preparedness. Now, back in the 1950s, in a town called Minamata, there was a case of mercury poisoning where one factory in the area was dumping mercury waste into the river from where the people sourced their drinking water. And it resulted in various forms of sickness, one of which were deformities in children and also deformities in animals and fish that also use the water, and loss of motor control and over muscles and deterioration in that sense. But that attitude of looking after the company, looking after the industry, rather than showing primary care for the people that were being negatively affected by it, seems to still pervade and was pervading around the organisation and setup and care of the Daiichi nuclear power plant. Paul, do you think that is a fair enough summary of the way things happened?
I think what you say is in general accurate, but it's a lot more complex than that. If I may say something about Minamata first, the company was dumping mercury into the sea, and the people of the town and other towns were eating the fish from the sea there. So it wasn't a river and it wasn't drinking water. It was so it affected a much sort of bigger area than, the river would have. But Fukushima, it's hard to know where to start. First of all, the company responsible for the nuclear power plants in Fukushima is TEPCO, T-E-P-C-O, Tokyo Electric Power Company. And the biggest shareholder of TEPCO is the government. The government owns 51% of TEPCO shares. And not just with TEPCO, but with other electrical companies too. The other electrical companies that have built nuclear power stations. Like, the government has been protecting them and assisting them in various ways from the very beginning. As you say, I've been in Japan for 40 years, and I've literally read thousands of newspaper, magazine articles about nuclear power here. And the number of accidents there have been in nuclear power plants, many sort of unreported in the daily press, and the number of mistakes made by the power companies and by the regulatory bodies is staggering. I mean, there are literally thousands of serious mistakes they have made. Like, for example, one of the almost incredible mistakes is that some nuclear power plants here are built directly above earthquake fault lines. Now, of course, earthquakes are very common in Japan. They happen like almost every day. Everyone knows that they happen, that they're going to continue to happen. And I would expect that when they're choosing a site for a nuclear power plant, that they would sort of check for the presence of fault lines. But either they, in some cases at least, they haven't, or if they have, their checks were insufficient. And this has been going on for decades. And of course, the government, the regulatory bodies know all about this, and they have allowed it to continue.
There seems to be a decisive effort, not just in Japan, but in other parts of the world as well, to promote nuclear power as a safe and clean source of electricity.
Yes.
And yet the explosion in Chernobyl, in Russia, the one in Fukushima, and as you mentioned, mistakes and other tragedies that have happened in nuclear reactors that haven't been reported, or maybe didn't have the devastating results and the devastatingly visible results that Chernobyl and Fukushima did, are being covered up. And yet they're the very events that challenge this myth, but somehow or other vested interest seems to continue to want to push for nuclear power. And it reflects in some ways, I think, an attitude of a lack of care for people. I remember watching television shots of the people in Fukushima, and they were dazed. They were almost wandering around aimlessly in a way that was consistent with accounts I've read of people after the nuclear explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the survivors just wandered, not particularly going anywhere and not with any plan, and seemingly without any consciousness of what they were doing. And then when they were directed to move, many of them were directed to go to a place that was more dangerous rather than one that was safer. And this seemed to reflect a total lack of any plan of what to do and how to react and how to address problems in a reactor when something went wrong.
Yes. This is one of the puzzles, like why nuclear power? Why continue to promote nuclear power? Why to continue to claim that it is safe and clean? It's biggest belief,
And it's a sort of a conundrum because like Japan is a country that does so many things very well. And yet at the same time, it can do other things extremely badly. And it's probably not a unique situation to Japan, but there's a strange kind of contradiction there, that in some circumstances they act with great care and great genius. In other circumstances, maybe parts of the projects have genius, but they really lack the care for people. And perhaps the big care is the big Y with the two lines through it, the yen, or the dollar. And there's a strange kind of inconsistency there. Do you find that type of attitude in any other parts of life in Japan?
Well, yes, in many other parts of life here. Now, for me, it all goes back to the Americans. When William Perry decided to pay a visit to Japan, I think it was about 1868, somewhere around there.
Somewhere around that is 1865 to 1868, I think, somewhere in that.
Yeah, he came twice, actually. At the time, like America, of course, was much stronger economically, militarily than Japan. And America forced Japan to open up to the rest of the world. Japan had largely been cut off from the rest of the world. America forced it to open up. Japan realised that it wasn't strong enough to oppose the US or Europe. So the Japanese decided to modernise very quickly, like almost overnight sort of thing. They put everything into modernising, to building up industry from scratch, you know, railways and power plants and the military, everything else. And of course, they became quite confident, overconfident. They started the war in Asia. They lost. And since the end of the war, they've been trying very hard to regain lost ground. But it seems to me that the attitude they had in the beginning to sort of industrialise, to modernise as quickly as possible, I think that attitude is still here. The government still favours industry over the people in general. Like with Minamata, for example, the company was allowed to continue to pour mercury into the bay for quite some time, even after the problem became known. And if the company had spent about $50 on a filter on the pipe going into the sea, they could have prevented the pollution. It would have taken only $50 or so, but they didn't do that. And the government didn't clamp down on them. And still now, like the problem of Minamata hasn't been entirely cleared up. There are still victims who haven't been compensated. And that's the attitude in general of the government towards industry in Japan. And it's the same with nuclear power, with TEPCO, with Fukushima.
Now, one of the offspins of the Second World War, which you know Japan lost, it was a terribly violent encounter. It involved a lot of people and it left a lot of bitter memories. Like many people in Australia, for example, after the war, there were bitter attitudes towards the Japanese and an attitude of mistrust, which in many ways has probably gone on right up until today, but for some two or three decades was extremely strong. And when you were appointed to go to Japan from Australia, did you meet any kind of resistance from your friends or people that you knew at that time? They asked you, why are you going to a country like Japan?
I didn't meet any resistance.
Right.
But I'd have to say that when I told my parents that I was going to go to Japan, they were not particularly pleased. Of course, my father was in the war, in the Air Force.
Right.
I think 5 of his brothers were in the various armed forces. At least one of my mother's brothers was in the military. My father's eldest brother died on Bougainville just 2 weeks before the end of the war. And one of my father's brothers had stayed in Ballarat to help his father in my grandfather's butcher's shop. And when my grandfather heard that his eldest son had been killed in Bougainville, he gave the keys of the shop to his son there and walked out. But later on, I took some Japanese friends to Australia. I took them home to meet Mum and Dad. And mum and dad sort of, very hospitable. Of course, from the moment I arrived in Japan, the Japanese were extremely hospitable to me. Absolutely no ill feelings whatsoever. Even though some Australian troops stationed in Japan after the war had done some things that they could not be proud of.
Yes, I think that's one thing that tends to get overlooked. Atrocities are not the prerogative of only one side. And I think also in the commercial world, atrocities are not the prerogative of only one country. Like investments in extremely suspect kind of industries, arms industries, industries that do great damage to the ecology of particular countries, especially poorer countries, is something which is fairly common to all the industrialized nations. But you were telling me beforehand that Japan has been investing in many ways in some places, which seems to be quite unethical.
Yes, well, yeah, Japan and many other countries. I am particularly interested in environmental issues. And one of the big environment issues at the moment is the destruction of the Amazon rainforest.
Right.
That's been a problem for a long time, but under the present leader of Brazil, the destruction is sort of happening at a much faster pace. I get the impression that the leader of Brazil won't be disappointed if the whole Amazon is cut down. Anyway, I decided to try to find out if any Japanese companies, corporations, are involved in the destruction of the Amazon. And I looked at various environmental organizations' websites. And Greenpeace Japan has a little bit on the Amazon, just a little bit. They don't seem to be sort of doing much about it. But apart from that, it seems that sort of no organisation here is trying to protect the Amazon. So then I looked at some websites of environment organisations outside Japan. And one in particular, an American organisation, Amazon Watch, has quite a bit of information about those responsible for the destruction of the Amazon, responsible for the destruction and then for the creation of like farms and ranches where there used to be forest. So I've been reading some of the files on Amazon Watch's website. And those files include names of 30 or 40 Japanese organisations, including some of the major trading houses and banks, and also the Government Pension Investment Fund, GPIF. So at the moment, I'm trying to figure out what my next step should be, what exactly to do about this.
Yeah, I think the struggle to, for a start, recognise the cost of destruction that's being caused to the natural world seems to be still a struggle in its infancy, and the struggle to kind of control the strength of the commercial interests in the world into exploiting what really can be a great resource for people in many ways, and yet to convert that long-term resource into a short-term resource, irrespective of the damage. I think that's the work that's very much in its infancy. Anyway, Paul, it's been great to talk to you today. Lovely to see you again and hear some of your insights into a society which really is quite a complex society, and yet in many ways from the outside tends to be looked at rather simplistically. I think that's really enlightening to hear those reflections. We've been talking today with Fr Paul McCartin from Japan, and thank you very much, Paul, for giving us your time today.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Anytime.
We've been talking to Fr Paul McCartin in Japan, and I'm Fr Jim Mulroney for Meet a Columban.